Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 58th episode of Retuning Your Firm. I'm Richard Chaplin, and I'm going to be your host today. And we've got a really great panel coming up today. So first, we've got Lucy Blythe, and Lucy is the founder director of Philia International. And Lucy's going to be talking to us today about a topic we haven't covered in the nearly 15 months we've been running this show, which is not so much how boards work, which we've covered in great depth, but what about professional development through serving on a non-profit board, which is an area that she is, as she was saying, as a former executive working in a lot of non-profit organizations, thought that she'd seen some great boards and some that were less brilliant, and that she could hopefully make the less brilliant more brilliant, and that's what she's been doing for the last 10 or 15 years. So looking forward to that. Welcome, Lucy. Our second guest is Professor Stephen Mayson. Stephen is an independent non-executive director and advisor. Anybody in the legal sector will have heard of Stephen. I think it's probably true when that's, he's written some very influential reports, and he's coming to talk to us today about the sustainability of the big law business model. Now, if you're not working for a big law organization, but if you're in the legal sector, you cannot ignore the 800-pound gorillas. So knowing a bit more about the sustainability of their business model, I think it's going to be really interesting. So looking forward to that. Welcome, Stephen. We now come to our regulars. So firstly, I would like to welcome today Francesca Lagerberg. Francesca, as you know, has been with me for, I think this is her 55th occasion, quite a long time, but brilliant. And as we said last week, one of the viewers did ask if they could start up the Francesca fan club, which she said she'd send them a £5 note for, because she thought that was great. So anyway, day job, global leader for network capabilities of Grant Thornton International. So there's very little happening in the Grant Thornton network that she's not aware of. So it brings that amazing perspective. And our last regular, second regular, if you like, is Jeremy Beard. Jeremy is the managing partner of Haysmacintyre, and he's been with us. I haven't actually done the count, but it's probably about 20, I should think, and something of that order. But anyway, always it's great, because what I love about Jeremy is that we share all sorts of interesting ideas on the show, and he will say, that's a good idea. Yeah, let me see if that one works with us as well, or tell us how they've been doing some great things within his firm. So lovely to hear that sort of very honest and helpful perspective. So thank you, Jeremy. And of course, yours truly, the founder and chief exec of the Managing Partners Forum, and your proud host for today. I think that's about the best way to put it. Before we go on with the poll, which is kind of the next big chunk of today, just wanted to kind of give you a little catch up on the forum and what the forum's been up to, and where we think we're going to. First of all, if you haven't seen the summit videos, they're getting a lot of traction at the moment. So you probably will have seen them in the invitation you got for today. So do check out those, because it was a really good session. It picked some of the most popular videos on YouTube across the whole of the first year of this show. And lots of people are watching those videos, by the way. It's over at, I think, 1,200 in the last month, something like that. So it's quite significant. In fact, I kind of almost talked today about today being the studio audience and a bigger audience on YouTube, but that's fine. That's the way TV works, I think. Peer groups, we've got a lot of good 24 or 100% renewals, I think I mentioned last week. And there's a couple of new groups we're starting up in the autumn. So either myself or Claire will be in touch with you about that, to see if that's something that would be of interest. The other area that we've been working on and are just moving into a sort of pilot phase is what we're calling our fast track innovation framework. And if you recall, over the last 2 or 3 years, was working with 4 business schools and the University of the Arts, a free wiki, and then we've also been looking at bespoke sprints. And I'll be coming back, letting people know how that works, because I think that's really going to help you, not just much sharing the knowledge, but also giving you some great tools so you can use the knowledge. The show is taking a break. Today is our last show until the 17th of September. And then we're going to be fortnightly after that. So we'll keeping the flame burning. And in the meantime, we'll be shortly be launching some networking clubs, which again, I think are something that will be very helpful. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the polls. Well, the poll results are incredibly valuable in our analysis during these dynamic times. That's the feedback we had from government. I can't really add to that other than saying that hopefully you'll be completing the poll shortly. And it's not just the audience, is not just today's audience or the people who look at it when we create the infographic, but it also goes to government. So, and they do find it quite hard to find out what our sector feels, I think, particularly in the mid-market group. So what I'm going to do today now is just quickly take you through what were the key messages that came out of last week's poll, which, if you remember, was the monthly tracker. And very bullish, I think, was the main expression I would have said. Firms were sort of 70 to 80% of firms were expecting expansion, and no firms were expecting contraction over the next year. And that covered both activity levels, headcount, and new workflow. I can't really add much to that. We've never seen it that bullish before. What about the topics that people are actually talking about in the partner director discussions? Financing cash flow remains top of the list. People comes in second, and marketing in third place. And we've kind of seen marketing really rising up the list. And then now I think the people agenda is starting to re-emerge. And the reason I say that is that the focus in priority remains operational efficiency. And as regards constraints, employee turnover and skills gaps are now top of the list. And I think that has changed. I mean, employee turnover was not included by anybody as a constraint 6-9 months ago, and now it's pretty much near the top, and the skills gap as well. And the two that were at the top, which were to do with the financial health of clients and the economic climate falling away. Now, it may be, and this is only conjecture, that the economy has been kept buoyant by the government funding, 300 billion or whatever the crazy number is, and that's helped people pay bills. And we normally find in our sector that we actually get hit, as we did in 2008. We were hit in about 2010. So are we being too buoyant? Who knows? But anyway, that's the current senses. We're moving back to supply, I think, really, you could call it. Far fewer firms are now looking to reduce their office space post-COVID. And again, I think that may be a function of growth. No one's looking to increase, but our firms are looking to increase. So then maybe the space is there for them. So what else have we seen? I'll make this one a bit bigger so you can see it. There's been a growth in headcount expectations. And it's really, I don't think I've ever seen nobody, which is in red, which is the contraction, 0%, and the expansion, 86% in headcount. And if you look back over the past 18 months or so, the blue line has generally been below the red line, but that's certainly not the case now. Back in February 2020, Boris Bounce territory, once called, it was 59% 8, and now it's 86-0. So red hot labour market, and I hear that from all sorts of people at the moment. The other one I'm just going to talk a bit about quickly, is just the only other one I'll show you, is the constraints. And the one I mentioned before, which is the blue one, which is employee turnover, which was literally, go back to October, November, December, was down at 0 and is now actually top of the pack. And the other one that's come through is the purple one, which is skills. So you're seeing a complete shift away from, gosh, where's the work, to, gosh, how can we service the work? And I think that is something that we may well pick up later. So those are a couple of slides which I just wanted to share with you from last week. And now move on to today's poll. And I just thought, as we're now very close to the 19th of July, I was reading today in the media that there's a sort of an abbreviated version of all the guidance that the government's put out on the issue of offices is about to be issued. But I thought it might be quite interesting just to run through and say, well, what's the what is the impact of lockdown been? So what are the things that I'm looking for you to think about and then answer in a minute or so? First would be, what's the general mood over the end of lockdown and over returning to the office? They're not quite the same thing. To what extent are your people currently self-isolating? The hospitality industry, apparently it's 1/3. I don't think it's going to be quite as high in our sector, but let's find out. In terms of work carried out on the office, to what extent have you reconfigured, prepared for this new horizon, or whatever we're going to call it? Are you looking to give more flexibility in working hours when people are in the office? We talked a bit about the hybrid dimension, but when they're in the office, is there more flexibility going to be coming in there? What's been the overall impact of lockdown on your firm? I mean, some people are telling me it's been positive. Let's see. And then what about the emotional dimensions? What about changes in happiness? Strange word I know to use in business, but it's actually quite important. Mental health are the other sort of, and even conflict, because one's seen some situations in which conflict has become more difficult because of communication challenges. And this is really just a personal interest. Your thoughts? Do you think lockdown's going to be reimposed next year, anytime in the next year, or do you think we are genuinely irreversible? So where are we at? Well, I kind of worked. The first one was a bit cheeky, but I thought, well, let's try and, we got some people for whom this is the general mood of the lockdown restrictions being lifted is elation. And at the bottom, I had panic. There was nobody with panic. That's something. But most people, I think, at it are slightly more towards positive, but the neutral. And number 3 is the one that's picked up most votes, but it's about 1/3, 1/3. General mood over returning to the office. That's the second one. That one is neutral. That comes through very strongly. And that is a fundamental shift from where we were before, but the apprehensive still outweigh the relaxed. So not something that we can completely be complacent about. In terms of self-isolating, about 20% of you are nothing at all, 0. 45% is less than 5. One person or one over 20%, and then a few in the 5 to 10, but less than 5%. So it's clearly not a massive issue if we believe what we read about the dreaded ping hitting 2 people every time somebody is diagnosed with COVID. Then I think that may well change, but that's anywhere we're at now. In terms of what have people done to reconfigure their office for social distancing, and that's quite interesting. I think my sense there is that modest changes is basically 64% of you. Nobody's done a complete redesign. You may have read about it in the media, but it's obviously few and far between. And 10% have done nothing at all. So not as much has happened in that space as possibly the media would have us believe. To what extent will you be providing greater flexibility? To a significant extent is 36%, 50% to some extent. So that's 86 have done something, and 5% not at all. So yeah, people are looking at, I think, at that flexibility. If nothing else, it helps with the commuting because people can stagger their commuting to avoid being in full tube trains, etc. This is quite an interesting one. I really like this one. So what's your overall assessment of the impact of lockdown on your firm? And we have 41% who think it was positive and 41% who think it was negative. So what's that telling me? It's saying that, and the neutrals are 18. So there's an interesting mix there in terms of how people see the impact. No very negatives, and everybody, no one's saying too early to say. So clearly people have made their mind up on that. We will take a view maybe in 6 months' time as to whether that's still true. What about happiness? Modest decrease, 60% saying there's a modest decrease, 5% a significant decrease, 32% about the same. So happiness has not increased. So people are not, so hopefully that will change once people are back in the office. Has there been a change in lockdown in the proportion of people with mental health issues? 70% saying modest increase, 5% significant increase. Well, that's over 70% of you are reporting that your people have more mental health issues than before. And that, I know, it's something I've read a lot about in the media, but it's interesting to see that from this group. Have you observed any changes during lockdown in the level of conflict? About even Stevens on that one, about the same as 50%, about 30% have seen an increase, and 25% have seen a decrease. So no obvious trends there. And the one that the government will be, obviously, well, they may not be interested, because I'm sure they listen to many people, but certainly the message from this group is that 64% of you think it's likely that some restrictions will be reimposed, and 9% think it's highly likely, and only less than 30% think if it's unlikely. So irreversibility may be for the birds. And thank you all for completing the poll. It's always very helpful. I will be doing the infographic and making that available to you in the next few days. So hopefully you'll find that interesting, and obviously please share internally, because I think it's quite helpful just to take in the temperature as we're kind of coming to the end of this phase that we've been in for. Well, everybody talks about last year and thinks about 2019, but 2020 did exist, and that's kind of, we just looked at some of the implications today. So what I'd like to do now is to turn to my first guest, and very much welcome Lucy, who's going to come and talk to us, as I mentioned before, about the whole area of what does it actually mean to be on a non-profit board, and how can you actually use it as a professional development opportunity. Over to you, Lucy.
It's such a big topic, actually. I've spent most of my life dealing with boards in one way or another. And I think the first thing I wanted to say is just that serving on a nonprofit board can be a really magnificent experience, learning, growing, meeting new people, and sharpening the saw, really, especially if you're very busy with your own work. I have found my own board experience some of the most satisfying experiences of my life. And working with a lot of boards, when they are well run, they can actually have a lot of fun doing good. So I'm just going to run you through really quickly the benefits to you of serving on a nonprofit board, what you may have to offer, and how you might go about getting onto one. Some of this will be really basic, so forgive me, but I thought I'd cover the basics. So benefits to you, and I know this isn't where we should start, it should be starting with the cause, but I'm talking to this particular audience, and I want to encourage people with these kinds of professional skills to think seriously about sharing those. So first of all, there's been a lot of research about why people join boards, and one of the biggest reasons is because of the other people on the board. This is just a fact. And it is true that joining boards often enables you to expand your networks, not only within influential, energetic, smart people, but also people with different experience and skills. And so it broadens your network, which can be incredibly valuable, especially as you grow in your career and start operating at a higher level. You will meet ideally peers, other professionals, community and business leaders, thought leaders, and people with lived experience. This experience on your CV can look good. It can show evidence that you are a more broad-minded person and that you are socially engaged, and that you have a broad mindset looking at your own world. In terms of the skills that you can hone or develop in the course of board service, obviously strategy and planning, risk management, crisis planning, financial oversight, legal responsibility, and quite often fundraising and advocacy. There are lots and lots of things that you can develop depending on how the board uses your skills. But one thing that is important to remember is the difference between board service, which is really oversight, and strategic thinking, and volunteering. Because if you are a professional with accountancy skills or legal skills, the board may value you for that, but if you are applying them very specifically, that's more a volunteering role. And when you're on the board, it's really about the oversight and above the court looking down, fingers out, noses in is the expression a lot of people use. The other thing that's good for you is that you get recognized, and quite often that can be personally incredibly satisfying. You can bring things to the board that are not being used necessarily in your own profession. And a really important part of what you learn is board dynamics, is the working in a team to do the strategic thinking, even things like where you sit around the board table and how you relate to the other board members. A whole host of things, but I'll move on to what you have to offer. Obviously, your particular professional skills and knowledge, but very importantly, asking intelligent questions. That is the most important thing the board can do. You've got to have passion for the cause. If you don't bother, because you won't be a good board member. You will be an empty seat. And the expectations of board members will differ according to the organization, whether it's large or small, its mission, the particular challenges it faces. It might particularly value your property experience or your accounting or legal experience. It also may need more or less time from you depending on how it's structured. Another thing to consider is your background, and that is where you come from, what ethnic group you come from, your own personal perspective. A lot of boards are really specific looking at diversity, and that's not just ethnic diversity, it's age. Digital natives are rare and valuable, and every board should have some. Geography. There are a lot of London boards that have no one outside London, but it's a national charity. And your lived experience. So you may have experience of a particular condition or a challenge or a passion for a particular art that you can bring to that board. The most interesting thing to offer is your ability to think generatively, strategically. So for instance, if you're on a symphony board, you might ask, our audience is aging, how can we appeal to younger audiences? This is not getting into the specifics of marketing, but actually asking the questions and probing so that the executive come up with solutions that you can approve or help move on. So how to get onto a nonprofit board. Even now, when a lot of them are much more professional in their recruitment processes, who you know and getting into boards, talking to people is probably the most valuable thing. But there are also a lot of trustee opportunity lists. Search firms for the bigger organizations are involved. So talk to search firms, look at trustee lists of opportunities, go to the NCVO website, and initially do understand your roles and responsibilities. You can get that from the NCVO Know-How Board Basics website. There's some good stuff there. And also for any charities you want to target, contact them directly and tell them about your interest. But make sure you do your due diligence on them first. Look them up on the Charity Commission website. Find out about their background, their trustees, their financial history. And please get involved early. Don't wait until you are in your 50s. Get involved even in your 20s or 30s, because boards need younger people.
I love the passion at the end there, Lucy. Thank you very much, and thanks for. I appreciate some of that will be applehood and motherhood and my motherhood for some people, but actually those basics are really, really important. And I often think that as a board member, you shouldn't even tell them that you're a professional, because the skills you built, which you are just obvious, are things that other people sometimes don't even have. Right, moving on to our second guest now. Delighted to welcome Stephen Mayson, Professor Stephen Mayson, get it right, and who's an independent non-exec director and advisor. So another link to boards. I think boards are going to be quite a big topic today. And he's going to talk about a very different topic again, something that perhaps in the mid-sized firm you don't really hear as much about, but the impact of the 800-pound gorillas, as I call them, or the big law business model is really, really important. So he's going to talk to us with a wealth of experience about what is the sustainability of that model. Over to you, sir.
To some extent, the notion of the big law business model is probably a misnomer. I think the business model originated in big law firms, but it's not confined to them. So I'm not necessarily talking about size. I'm also, in the time available, inevitably going to generalize. So forgive me if I oversimplify and draw maybe some apparently unsupported conclusions. We can explore those later. But I have to say, I've worried about the sustainability of the big law business model or the law firm business model for a number of years. And what really brought it into sharp relief was a comment last week in the Times, which I'll just read to you. So, I'm a junior lawyer in London. I get paid around £135,000 a year. They don't pay as well because the job is good. They pay as well because the job is awful. I still wish I'd listened to the many voices telling me not to do it. The job is extremely stressful and all-consuming, and involves dealing with unpleasant people on a daily basis. If you're a bright young graduate considering this path, find something else to do, unless you have vaguely sociopathic tendencies, in which case you may thrive. And that really got me thinking about the nature of big law practice in particular, but the business model that underpins it. So is that model sustainable? Let me take in turn each of what I think the four elements of a business model are. Their value, resources, returns, and financing. Those four elements will apply to any business. I'm going to apply them to law firms and big law in particular. So let me start with the first one, creating value for clients. I think it's the most important and it's the least well understood element of the business model. The big law model essentially says value is cost plus based on time. In other words, it's an internal, outward-looking model. But I don't see how creating value can be found in time-based billing. Value is based on outcomes to the client, not the time input of the lawyer. And outcomes in this context for me are things like the terms of the deal that you're able to get for the client, the price or the settlement that you can agree, maybe even the relationships that you can retain or repair on behalf of a client. So it's not about added value, shouldn't be confused. Added value is things like client entertaining, legal updates, secondments even. They're for me around the periphery. They don't go to the core of what we should be doing as law firms. And I'd also say you can't constantly move up the value chain in response to competition, whether that's from niche firms, from in-house legal departments, from alternative legal services providers. All that would do was just push more firms further up the value chain, chasing less work. So for me, I think creating value has to involve innovation. It has to involve integrating different types of inputs. And unfortunately, they are things that are typically discouraged in law firms. And finally, I'd say on this that innovation, and for that matter, competitive advantage, don't come from asking who else has done this. Second element of the business model then is resourcing to deliver that value. And the big law business model is essentially human resource, and it's predominantly lawyer human resource. We all know that employment costs are the biggest component by far of a professional service firm's cost base. And yet here we are employing more professional people, paying them more year on year. We've seen the salary rises recently announced. So we're turning what should be a variable cost essentially into a quasi-fixed cost. Is that a good basis for a business model? So I think we need to start working on reconfiguring and combining different elements, mainly of intangible capital. So yes, the human, but social capital, technological capital, organizational capital. Look at what technology and process in particular can do to deliver value and efficiency. And we also need to rethink the balance of internal and external resources, because less than we think needs to be done internally by lawyers. Third element then is allocating the returns that you get from using those resources to deliver value. And here we start with the notion of net profit in a law firm. And I think what too few firms figure out is that actually net profit is a return to three different things: to partners' labor, to capital employed, and to risk undertaken in the business. In the big law business model, that's all rolled into a single return measured as profit per equity partner. It's a short-term, income-based, fully extracted, probably tax inefficient approach to returns. It's rife with perverse incentives as well, relating to personal productivity, that horrible notion of client ownership, internal competition, underinvestment. And when making profit becomes harder, the focus switches to managing the denominator. In other words, firms manage down the number of equity partners so that profit per equity partner can still go up even if revenue or profits are flat or even declining. And then the fourth element, financing the business to deliver that value, resourcing appropriately and generating a sustainable return. The big law business model on this is internal equity and external debt. and even for the most part, the internal equity is often financed by external debt. Not surprisingly, that approach of profit extraction often leaves firms struggling with capital needs for cash flow, to meet their debt repayments, to invest in growth and innovation, even to repay capital for former or retired departed partners, which then puts even more over-reliance on short-term debt through overdrafts. The full range of financing options would consider debt and equity, internal and external, private and public, short-term and long-term. There's a way to go on financing. So, what's my conclusion? A business model only works if each element is aligned with the others, and all are aligned to a longer-term strategy and the market. Too often what we see in law firms are fragile coalitions driven by short-term, individualized incentives where hardly any of the elements of a business model have been thought through, let alone truly aligned. So no, on the face of it, the big law firm business model doesn't seem to be a recipe for sustainability. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln?
Did you enjoy the theatre? Exactly. Stephen, that was amazing. Thank you very, very much. Right, I'm now going to welcome my regulars, and we'll start off today with Francesca. And Francesca, we've talked a bit about boards, and particularly not-for-profit boards, and how they can be a sort of stepping stone. And we've heard from a rather sort of very almost clinical dissection of some of the problems with the way that not just big law, but many law firms operate, and possibly even some accountancy firms. But over to you.
Really good to be with you as always, Dan. Thank you for both of those conversations. I've just got 2 points that really stood out for me that I'd like to dial up a little bit. First of all, in relation to not-for-profit work, and the very last point that Lucy made, but a really powerful one, I think, for our people, is around the value of people going on to boards when they're young and not waiting till they're in their 50s or 60s or 70s in some cases. Because the experience you get is extraordinary. You know, if you're in your 20s and you're working at a professional service firm, you're probably getting a bit of responsibility, you're involved in running a bit of a team, you're beginning to get in front of clients. But the variety you get in a not-for-profit organisation is huge. Very often you're involved in strategic issues that you perhaps wouldn't get as much insight on in some organisations. And you're having to think holistically at a good age, where you've got to think about the tensions between fundraising and delivery and the many aspects of it. And most not-for-profits need people, really need people. They need young people, but they need bodies who are really keen and passionate and want to do things. So it's such a fantastic way. And I try and encourage all of our people in our organisation to pick a charity, to do something that they're passionate about as an add-on to what they're doing in work, because it will give them amazing exposure. They'll find many things they're excited about, but it also gives them an insight that sometimes they don't get access to until they're a little bit older in professional services firms. So I think just a fantastic way. And my goodness me, are charities struggling at the moment in the UK? So the real need for people with enthusiasm and passion is enormous. So that's one element of it. And one piece, Stephen, thank you for that analysis of how big law firms work. Funnily enough, does resonate a little bit with large accounting firms. Not a total surprise there. You wouldn't create it if you were starting today. I think is probably the truth. In fact, partnerships I do find quite a weird concept in any event. Would you still create even partnerships at all today? I don't know. But again, just want to pick up one element of what you said. And there was such a lot in there, was around interesting work. That Times, I saw that Times letter, and apart from the fact I thought it was incredibly well written, but oh my goodness me, does that speak to the Gen Z moment that I don't think is about Generation Z. I think it's about every generation. You want to do interesting work. Why study for years and years and do dull stuff? And there's something quite challenging, again, for all professional services firms, is you bring in super bright people. You often train them. You often give them further education. You often fill their heads with a huge amount of potential ability and skill, and then give them some of the dullest work in the world to do for a couple of years and wonder why they leave you after 3 or 4 years. So a massive challenge, I think. And it takes me way back to that excellent report the ACCA did on Generation Z, which I think we had a great session on one of the conversations on a Friday panel. But in there, I think you could put that across almost every generation, that desire to have things that are going to be challenging. And can you take away some of the duller, more repetitive work to free that up for people? But if you can't, how can you also make sure there are things that are stretching and challenging for those who really do want to do something that is more exciting than looking at a fixed asset register, which is sometimes the work that you do on very, very large audits, for example. Okay, Richard, back to you.
Yeah, well, I certainly have those audit scars. I remember that one of the exciting things I had to do was this was up in the north, and we were trying to value some castings, and the only way you could tell what they were worth was by lifting them because of the metal content. And that was quite cold. So over to Jeremy, and we've had some really interesting thoughts today. Jeremy not only has a very good understanding of the not-for-profit, because it's an area in which his firm is very highly rated, but also he, as the managing partner, will, I'm sure, have views on helping people become more charity focused early on, and also picking up the last point about how do you make work interesting for people in your firm as the managing partner, because you will get much higher buy-in, I suspect, if you achieve that one.
Yeah, I think the interesting work is a challenging one. I suppose there's a couple of comments I would make there. First of all, I would put our priorities at the moment as people number one, people number two, and people number three. I know there were slight differences on some of the surveys, but absolutely that is the key for us at the moment. Our people, as in most professional firms, I think at the moment, and I talk to a number of other firms, are there's a lot of work around, an enormous amount of work around, and they're under a huge amount of stress and pressure. So we have gone to our senior managers, our directors, and said, right, how can we make your life better? What can we do to help you? And that doesn't necessarily mean in this context and at this point in time what is interesting work, but it does mean what is difficult work, what is high risk work that we're not getting paid the right amount of money for, what is difficult clients, unpleasant clients to deal with. How has our business evolved over the last few years such that we've perhaps got a group of clients that are no longer appropriate for us? So there's a whole host of factors that come into play that we've asked our guys, and they're feeding back to us about why their job is problematical, why they are not enjoying it at the moment. So it's not entirely about interesting work. It's more about what is causing them problems. What is a real challenge? And there are some internal issues there. It's not just clients. There's some internal issues for us to deal with. But I think I've said on this call before, we are really proactively at the moment looking at the quality of our client base and making sure that we have good clients, which and we work a lot in the audit market, which inevitably, if we have good clients, that probably reduces our risk in that space as well, which is good. So I think those are the key points I'd say around that next generation. At the moment, is not necessarily about what is about enjoying, what is about interesting work. It's more about what are really causing them the challenges and problems at the moment. Just coming on to the not-for-profit boards, certainly I'd support everything that Lucy and Francesca have said, and I have been, obviously we act for a lot of not-for-profit clients, but I have sat over the years on a number of not-for-profit boards and continue to do so. I would encourage, and again, echo the comments about getting involved young. Get involved in something that you're passionate about. I think that point has been made already, and there's lots of not-for-profit organizations out there. You know, I've sat on probably 4 or 5 different sports bodies, which is a passion for me, and some were charities, some are not charities, and they've been really interesting and really useful experiences. I think what it does do for the younger generation, and we encourage our guys to do it, but you know, if we've got an audit manager of 27, 28 years old, what it enables them to do is get a wider view of management, not just of finance. And I always say to them, don't just go to that board with your finance hat on. You're on that board to have a wider role and gain a wider understanding. Obviously, you're expected to have a greater knowledge of finance, but it's a great opportunity to get that wider experience of how an organization runs, which they might not get in their day-to-day job.
Perhaps I can turn to Lucy now and talk a little bit about maybe some of the governance issues, which because I've kind of come across situations where I've seen a very successful professional being invited to join a board, and it's kind of obvious that the primary reason they've invited them is because they want to pick their brains and save some professional fees, and that the clique that run the board aren't really going to be wanting to listen to any sort of management style advice. And how would, I mean, I know that shouldn't happen, but if you find yourself in that situation, what would you suggest somebody does?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would try not to get into that situation. The way I would do that is make sure that when you go onto a board, you have a really full and frank discussion with the people recruiting you about expectations on both sides. And that was the reason I made the point about the difference between board service and volunteer service, because as Jeremy said, when you're on the board, you have that overview role. You really shouldn't be asked to do the work of the organization. Of course, there's some exceptions. If it's a really small charity and there are no staff, the board often does all the work. I mean, I know that my husband's on a board, for instance, where there's a guy who does the finances part-time, and he's on the board and he's not paid. But, you know, for a larger organization, certainly it needs to be clear when you go on what they want from you. And that includes things like fundraising. So I always tell my clients to make sure that they have frank conversations with their candidates, because if they want them because they're wealthy and they think they're going to contribute and ask their friends to contribute, they'd better find out whether that's comfortable or not ahead of time, so they don't just have, you know, someone taking up space on the board who's going to say, no way, that's not at all what I'm here for. But to answer your question, what would I do if I were in that position? I would probably refer them to some of the best practice guidelines on board membership, and also the fiduciary responsibility of the board to make sure that it is employing proper professionals in a contractual way to do that kind of work. Does that help?
Well, I'm not the audience, but it certainly helped me. Thank you. Stephen, if I could pick up one of the, I mean, say your 4 points, and the particular one around showing value as being your first one. Where do you see the role of non-exec directors in that context? Because I know in many cases the managing partner will have a limited ability to bring about some of the changes that you were clearly indicating they should. So I know you sit on a number of boards as a non-exec director, and where does the influence come to bring about that change and make the model more sustainable, do you think?
Well, I think in terms of creating value, it really goes back to understanding what it is that clients value. So my immediate response is that I don't know that firms need too much input other than going and talking to the clients and making sure that relationship and their needs are fully understood and better understood than they are in many law firms. The role of a non-exec in that context, I think, would be to help that process. And it may be sometimes that the clients are more comfortable talking to a non-exec or even an external consultant rather than someone from the firm about how the firm's performing and what they would like to see the firm doing to create more value for them. And the role of the non-exec, I think, is to keep the firm honest to its own intentions and to make sure that it thinks through that element of a business model, but all of the elements of a business model. Is it actually doing what is in the best interests of the firm? Because as I more than perhaps once implied, too often in large law firms, it's what's in the best interests of any partner or coalition of partners at any given time, rather than this notion that you do get more of in corporates of what's in the best interests of the whole business.
And perhaps coming to Francesca now, and I know you've talked on a number of occasions about your non-exec chair and her role, and do you want to share a little bit about that and how that's helped you focus on value and other aspects of the business model?
Yeah, and I think the good corporate governance practice is to get a non-exec in these days. And if you can have multiple non-execs, there's a huge value to that. And we have talked about how sometimes that's expensive and firms can't do it or are reluctant to do it. But some firms club together to have the same non-exec, or they use some of the great organisations that provide non-execs at a sort of more reduced price. So just sort of putting that out there for context. But from our perspective, in both our UK firm, we've had non-execs chairing the Partnership Oversight Board for many years, and they bring a really different insight. They're fresh eyes. They're not so hung up on internal politics, always a massive plus. And they also just really challenge us around different things that we do that we might just take as that's just what we've always done. And they bring that different insight. On the global side of things, which is where I sit these days, we have our chair is also a non-exec. She's absolutely fantastic. She brings a global range of insight, but again, really challenges us on a whole raft of different things in terms of how we're running our network, what are we concentrating on, are we prioritizing, and also brings a very rigorous governance element to it because she comes from a strong governance background. But we also have another non-exec sitting on our global board who works at Google. He's a tech specialist, and oh my goodness, has that really given us insight, amazing insight into a completely different approach, a different organization, a different way of thinking. And given the sheer I think just scariness of where we're at on cyber in terms of how any business is operating. The cybersecurity must be one of your top risk factors, but also an amazing opportunity in terms of cyber as a service. Enormous. So you only have to look around the world and see some of those incredible impacts have been had by servers going down, major supplies being stopped. But for a professional service firm operating, you get a cyber attack and your business can be shut down for days or weeks. So hugely important to be very robust on that. And having someone coming from that insight, that knowledge really makes you look at things differently. So I think there's enormous value on different ways of looking at things and fresh insight that isn't scared to challenge.
Jeremy, we talked to, just perhaps staying with cyber for a second, we had a very interesting poll a couple of weeks ago, which is actually one of the most watched read polls I've had for some time, to be honest. And the fact that most people felt that it was an area that they could do better, I think is an elegant way of putting it. But from the sort of cyber security provision side, I mean, is that something you're finding your clients are increasingly asking you for?
Yes, although we don't offer that as a particular service to, or a specific service to our clients, but increasingly, obviously, it's coming into the audit environment and consideration of risk in that area, and certainly we as a firm have just gone through our first audit, having become an LLP a couple of years ago, and it was interesting to see the approach of a firm slightly larger than us in that regard. So certainly it is something that is going to be increasingly topical, and you know, the audit reform work that's going on around the white paper, the consultation I think has just closed either yesterday or today or imminently. You know, there's a lot of consideration there about what are the skills that are required now for an audit, and is it, you know, does it need a wider skill set than just those financial skills that historically we might have looked at? So certainly it is increasingly an important part. I think if I can just comment, Richard, on the non-execs piece, I think as a firm, we're probably just at that point. And just to recap, we're about 400 people in total, 38 partners. We're just reviewing our management structure. I think we're right at the point where we should be giving serious consideration to having some independent non-execs. There is also some pressure within the audit market to have some independence looking at your audit quality side of the business. So I'm very keen, and I think it also plays into the hands of the whole diversity piece around boards and making sure you have different skills, and it's not just a management board that consists of 5 accountants that have all trained at the firm and all have the same views. Which
I think across the professions is probably still the most common model. I know the big accountancy firms were basically told by their regulators that they had no choice, and then decided, well, if we've got one, let's have a good one. That's what I certainly heard from some of the big 4. But I think, that perspective, and I think we're now unfortunately at the end of our session for today. So I wanted to thank our illustrious panel. I'd like to thank Lucy for having shared her thoughts on initially from having worked within non-profits, and then thinking they could be better managed and better led and the rest, and then how that over 12 years has built a really powerful niche there, particularly in Africa. Actually, we didn't have time to talk about that today, but that's really interesting. I'd like to thank Stephen for his very, very helpful analysis. And I think it really was. I have to go back and watch that video at least 3 times just to pick up all the points. It was really insightful. So thank you very much for that, sir. And good luck with your next report. I always look forward to reading them. They do genuinely move the ocean when they come out. I'd like to thank Francesca for highlighting those 2 key points. And as I said, get in early when you're thinking about non-exec roles, and let's try and make work maybe happy. I don't know if that's interesting, probably a better word to go for. I think happiness is actually quite important. And Jeremy, thank you as always for just telling us so clearly where you're coming from. And I think most of the people on the show today will actually really relate to that, because they've also got pretty much the same intro that you have. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on those topics. Over for myself, really to say that we're not going to be now having another show until the 17th of September, which seems ages away. So I hope that you all have a wonderful summer break, and we'll look forward to a really interesting range of shows coming to join you in the autumn. And in the meantime, stay safe, because I think whatever may happen with government, staying safe will remain very much part of my thinking looking forward. Bye for now.